welcome to the latest installment of the Eyeota Audience Sessions. I'm Kristina Prokop, CEO and co-founder of Eyeota, and I am very excited to have here with me today Mathieu, the co-founder and CEO of ID5. And today we're doing a session together to talk about the state of identity. As a brief context, we have just expanded our relationship together to also work together with them on their universal ID product. So welcome Mathieu. Why don't you just give a quick introduction of yourself?
Good morning, Kristina. Very happy to be here. So I'm Mathieu Roche, and one of the co-founders and the CEO of ID5. And I've been in the data and the digital advertising business for longer than I dare count, but recently launched ID5 to address the increasingly challenging topic of identity. We came to the realization that not a super clever realization necessarily, but understanding that identity really underpins a lot of the things that make digital advertising valuable for brands, and that the open web, premium publishers, independent technology vendors are a massive disadvantage versus the walled gardens when it comes to identification capabilities. We've had to deal with third-party cookies for a long time, which were okay, but not perfect, right? Challenging mechanism to kind of keep track of users and understand users' behavior over time. So ID5 started operating in that space, and as we see kind of a future, I'm sure we're going to talk about this in more detail, but the future where those type of third-party ID spaces are less and less available, we've launched Universal ID, which we just started working with you guys on, to kind of provide an alternative ID when third-party cookies are not available. So this has been our story for the past over 2 years now, 2.5 years, and very excited to be on the show with you.
Yeah. And so that segues well into the question I had about the evolution of your business. So we started working together, I think about 1.5 years ago now, obviously not on the Universal ID product. So can you tell us a little bit about where the company has gone from inception into to date?
Yeah, of course. So we really set up ID5 as an identity company. Whatever the kind of the applications of that term, right? We're really looking at identity as the foundation of digital advertising, and looking at different problems. And so when we started 3 years ago, the main problem was, how do we scale with the limitations of cookie matching? Right? Cookie matching has been historically the method for platforms to work with each other, to share data with each other, to make a bid request understandable by a buyer, to make a point of data usable by a company. You have to go through matching because everybody uses different languages, different cookie spaces, and so you have to translate those spaces to make them compatible with each other. And this process doesn't scale well. So when we started ID5, the first problem we tackled was, how do we make cookie matching more scalable, more efficient? Because in the end, if Eyeota can match more cookies to a buyer's platform, it means more audiences available for the brand and more money for the data providers who's kind of providing those audiences, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of efficiencies to be gained. There's a lot of inefficient processes to be addressed. But what we've always done is looking at this as how we can provide solutions to actual problems, with a long-term goal, which has always been to redefine the way we identify consumers in a way that makes it more privacy compliant, recognizing that, with a European background, we knew that the GDPR was not just going to be limited to Europe, and I think we see that this is becoming the gold standard of privacy. And so how do we encompass this privacy element into what we do? More efficient, because again, efficiencies is what enables the walled garden to be better and to drive so much money from brands, because they're more efficient. So how can we build more efficiency? And really have built an infrastructure, built something that works for the entire open web, and not just one for one or the other players. So those have really been our focus. And so over time, as the market has evolved, right, from the initial issues around matching to the new issues around alternatives to third-party cookies, we've kind of evolved or complemented the ID5 value proposition with kind of different ways to look at this.
Yeah, it's interesting from our perspective. For the listeners, when we looked at originally working together, and alone just the situation of increasing scale and match rates across platforms, for us, we're always most interested in making sure we can get the most data possible as accurately as possible from point A to point B, and then sometimes to point Z. So from the collection and through us for processing and enhancing, and then out to the end platforms. And for us, it's always, it's always a juggling game, or, it was much more in the past of how do we prioritize the syncs of these platforms? Because you don't want to, what you end up facing, the question you end up facing is deprioritizing platforms that aren't necessarily ones you don't want to give less business to, but you have to make a choice somewhere. And so obviously those ones that naturally create the most revenue are the ones that get prioritized, which isn't always the way we would ideally like to handle the sync process. So I know from our perspective, it did alleviate a lot of those issues. So we saw a lot of positive impact in our business on that. So when was the point when you said, okay, development of the next phase, the next iteration of that product?
It was kind of always built in. What we're doing with Connect, the matching, the centralized matching service, is that basically we're using ID5 as the hub of a kind of hub and spoke relationship where we connect like 100 or so platforms to an ID5 ID, right? So we have an Eyeota ID connected to the ID5 ID. We have a Trade Desk, an AppNexus, a MediaMask, et cetera, et cetera. And so this ID5 ID that sits in the middle isn't used in itself, but it's used as a way to connect A to B, right? To connect the Eyeota to Trade Desk, connect the Eyeota to Adobe, et cetera, et cetera. But it's there anyway. And so when everybody has a cookie on a user, when third-party cookies are available, it's just a link. But when there is no cookie, we've built the ability to make that ID available in itself. So it's kind of been a transition between using this kind of hub and spoke model to using only the hub because the spokes are not available anymore, leveraging our publisher relationship and our kind of penetration on the publisher side to have this ID available not on a third-party basis anymore, but on a first-party basis. And that transition has been progressive. Again, it's always been the direction of travel for us, because we believe that by centralizing, we can apply a lot more controls, especially on privacy, a lot more controls on publisher data. There's a huge problem in the market around data leakage. Controlling identity enables publisher to control data a lot better and to know that they want to work with ID5 with Eyeota, but not with 25 other companies who might have access to their pages. So how do they make this process controllable, right? So there's always been this kind of view that by centralizing we'd have a better solution, but it kind of took several steps for us to get there. And today we're still in a market where third-party cookies exist in some places and they don't exist in other places. And so having both feet to stand on, both legs to stand on, kind of give us this flexibility.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's because it's a very similar situation that we find ourselves in, and how we're viewing the situation right now. Cookies aren't dead yet, and it will be a little while before they do. And regardless of which way which identifiers go, we've taken we've built the product now to handle everything in a similar fashion, that just to be, since none of us really know how all of this is going to end, we built the platform, or we've done a lot of upgrades over the course of the last 6 months to ensure as much flexibility as possible. Because again, for us, it's not, we just want to make sure that we get as much data possible and can transport through the ecosystem as seamlessly as possible. So, whether that's on a cohort ID, or whether that's on a matched into a first-party cookie, whether it's based on a hashed email, whether that's based on a third-party cookie, we also want to be able to make sure that we can process with any of those identifiers. Because I personally think the end game is going to be one individual type of ID that manages the ecosystem. So it will be, I think that flexibility of even for both of us being able to process multiple types of IDs effectively is I think the only
Yeah,
way
I
you can
agree.
do it right now.
I mean, this can be seen as a more complicated world, but the world is getting more complicated, right? Like there's more players in the ecosystem. There's more ways to identify users. There's more types of data that are available. There's more, algorithm on the buy side or the side how to optimize. It's getting more complicated, but also more efficient. I think we always have to kind of balance the efficiency and the complexity, right? Complexity per se is not a good thing.
Yeah.
Complexity, some level of complexity, if you can get to a point where you can more accurately understand consumers, more accurately address them, more accurately handle data about them, it's worth the effort, right?
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's very important what you're saying is that I think we have to recognize that the ability to identify users isn't a competitive advantage, shouldn't be a competitive advantage if we want, as an industry, to scale,
Mhm.
right? It's not something that DMPA should do or should claim to do better than DMPB, or that publisher A should claim to do better than publisher B. It has to be a shared kind of infrastructure approach,
Yep.
because in the end we're not fighting against each other. We're fighting against Google and Facebook as an industry, right? And so I think it's very important that we understand the benefit of joining forces so that we have a common infrastructure on top of which we can build, like you've done, right? By saying we want to be compatible with any infrastructure that scales because that's what enables us to be better.
Yeah.
I think it's not necessarily natural because historically people have kind of reported on how well they could their footprint, or it's that this is all going away. Like, it's not about how much better you can identify versus the other, because in the end it's going to be irrelevant versus the big platforms. So it's how you can embrace scalable identification methods so that we as an industry can operate better and kind of provide brand with a true alternative. They don't
Yep.
have to only spend on Google and Facebook. They can also spend on the open web, because this is a scalable alternative. This is a qualitative alternative. This is an efficient alternative, and that goes through this kind of letting go of this element. And I think this, we're seeing a lot more of that. I think there's an understanding that it has to be a kind of a shared infrastructure.
Yeah.
At least that's what we're pushing for.
So tell us a little bit about where you guys stand next to different consortiums and different initiatives in the industry.
Yeah, sure. So there's a handful of initiatives, I think, that are getting traction. Some of them are commercial entities like ID5. You could mention LiveRamp, obviously. You could mention Live Intent, maybe Bridepool in the US, people like that, which are more or less specialized in building identification capabilities as an infrastructure, right, on top of which Eyeota and like other DMPs and DSPs and SSPs can operate. And then you have a handful of solutions who are kind of provided bar market players, Trade Desk being the obvious one, but a few others as well, who are saying, I have a huge kind of scale on my own, and so I'm going to share that scale with others. I think that's like the neutrality versus the kind of the being a stakeholder, I think, is one main difference. We believe that there are a lot of conflicts of interest, and so this goes in the way of adoption. Being ID5 being a fully neutral entity, we're not involved in anything else, makes us different to that extent, right? We're not buying or selling media data. We're just providing an identities play. So that's one of the main difference that we believe we have over some of the players in the space. The other main difference is the method. We believe that identification should be an inclusive approach, right? It's not just when you have a logged in users that you should be able to identify user and to collect data about that user. It's when you have a relationship, whatever that relationship is. And we know that not all users are going to log in, right? There will be a lot of non-authenticated traffic. Is this traffic worthless? Not necessarily. And so our approach is to be inclusive in how we identify users, so to use logged in kind of HTML addresses when they are available, but also to build other methods to kind of create this kind of common identifier that works across domains, across apps, so that we can really scale that business and not kind of restrict it to the very small portion of users who will engage in a logged in relationship with publishers. So I think those, again, the neutrality versus and the inclusivity of the method, I think, are the two main differences that that we're pushing forward.
That's an interesting point, because I see, when I look at the importance that's being laid on identification against a hashed email address, or a login authentication, I also do see it's. I have a little bit the fear that it's one of those areas that is promising the golden key to our industry again, which is dangerous, because I also think I think people very, very quickly in our industry, there's one big hype and one big push, and that's sold as the answer to all of our challenges. But in reality, it's always been about the collaboration, the using each of these methods for solving the different problems at hand. And I also agree that, just being able to identify against a hashed email address or a login is, yes, absolutely very important. However, you can't run an entire marketing and advertising strategy based on login information. And so I think that's really smart if you guys are looking at spreading that out. And I think also, if you look at the way privacy is going, the pools that you have against login data and where where you're allowed to match against that, I mean, that could change too very quickly. I think it'll be. We're living in a very interesting time right now with all these changes happening so fast. Because number one, with all the identifiers plus the privacy at the same time, it's an interesting dynamic to follow.
We're really looking at this as like two sides of the same coin. I believe that identity is a consequence and an enforcer of privacy. Right? You need to have a relationship with users to have the rights to identify them and to collect personal data about them, right? That's the GDPR standards. That's what we've always kind of set as like the minimum requirement for us as ID5. We require consent or a legal basis to be provided to us by our partners to be able to operate the service. There's also an element of enforcement in a sense that ID is actually the key to unlock data. If you don't have an identifier, doesn't matter how much you know about a person or a user, you are not able to use it, right? Yeah. And so it has to be kind of privacy based, but it can also be a very strong privacy enforcement element. Mm-hmm. And we're doing a lot of work around encryption, around using hierarchical encryption mechanism to make sure that the ID is only usable by vendors and brands and partners who have a legal basis to do so. Yep. So I think it's yes, it's a challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity to rebuild the foundation of the industry in a much more inclusive way. Again, inclusive from a user standpoint, right? It's we've lived in a tracking by default world for a long time, which has been, antagonizing for a lot of users. We need to put the user back in the middle of the Lumascape, right? And consider that everything else revolves around the user. We can't do this without the user's involvement. And a big part of that is publishers' relationship with users, right? They need to enter into a relationship to explain the value exchange, to explain the different options, right? What's the menu of content you have access to? If you give me consent, if you give me an email address, if you subscribe to my content, right? There should be like tiers of value that and if you don't want to give me anything, fine, maybe you cannot have access to my site, or maybe you have access to a very, very kind of degraded version of my site, right? But that discussion needs to happen, because right now it's kind of an implicit value exchange, and it doesn't fit the legal requirements and potentially the expectation of users anymore.
So we're obviously here at Eyeota, we operate across a lot of markets, and we see a lot of differences globally where different markets are at in terms of the identifiers that are most prevalent and whether they can handle. Some of them don't even have the capability, or have products in market that allow, for example, to onboard against hashed email. And so I think like all of them are, and mobile usage, mobile ad ID prevalence versus cookie. For example, in Asia is much higher than, obviously mobile usage in Asia is still much higher than other markets.
Yeah.
So for your business, do you see, in the way that you operate, in the markets that you operate, do you see any differences between geographies?
So the problems are the same everywhere, but they're not necessarily as acute or perceived as acutely everywhere. The limitations of identity, all right, the ability to drop cookies, the ability to use cookies at all, the ability to collect data, and all of that is technically, the infrastructure is the same globally. So the problems we're addressing are the same globally. They're not as acute because I think there are two main things. One is platform usage. As you say, until recently, mobile advertising IDs were considered to be easily available, and so this kind of tracking by default method was pretty much the norm. And so in markets where mobile apps are dominant, like you mentioned, Asia, right? It's less of an issue because you have this. In markets where desktop traffic is still significant, like Western Europe, US, then the cookie problem, which is more acute, more like we're already limited on like 30 or 40% of traffic, right, because of Safari and Firefox. So it's a bigger problem depending on those differences. I think the other very important difference is the level of privacy awareness. It's not a surprise that there's a few companies that are progressing quickly on the data and the identity space that are coming from Europe, because we've built to this new gold standard that's been set by the GDPR, and we have an early mover's advantage, if you wish, in this kind of way to approach things. And so and I think equally our clients in Europe, right, have kind of understood the challenges and the need to kind of increase their game from a privacy compliance standpoint earlier than has been the case maybe in the US, where it's kind of becoming a discussion now with the implementation of the CCPA, but has been very much overlooked for a while. And even kind of more in Asia, where it's even less of a concern right now. It's going to become, I'm not worried it's going to become a concern everywhere. I'm not worried. I think it's going to become a concern everywhere.
I know what you mean.
But right now, those are the main differences, right? It's like platform usage, because obviously the ability to identify on different platforms is different. But mostly it's regulatory kind of where the bar is.
Yeah. Interesting. And we have seen that quite a few of the Southeast Asian countries are now following suit in terms of privacy legislation. Yep. So we're seeing a lot of changes. I think it's interesting to see that I think that the framework, not all of them have something like a framework or something to control it as detailed as GDPR and the consent framework here. However, they're getting there. I mean, it's a very large topic right now, and in all the RFPs that we get for data, compliance in local markets in Southeast Asia from new legislation is very much a part of it.
And it's not going to be exactly like GDPR everywhere, but the two pillars of GDPR, transparency and control, will be there, right? If you look at CCPA, it's not consent per se, but there's an element of transparency, there's an element of control, right? You can opt out of people selling your data. So again, the transparency is key. Making that information available, being able to explain, which is not an easy challenge to solve, right? It's a complicated industry. It's when you buy food, you don't necessarily ask everything that the food has been through, right? Like who's transported it, but so we're setting ourselves for a very high bar of kind of transparency because of this, and then control. Right, you need to be able to explain and then to give a choice and give control. And sometimes it will be an active control, like you have to say yes, or it will be a passive control, like by default it's yes, but if you don't want to, it can be no. And we'll see different markets adopting different ways, but like overall transparency and control. Yeah, they're the new reach and frequency.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So I have a crystal ball question for you to close things off. If you had to guess when the third-party cookie in Chrome really will disappear, When do you think that would be? Because I thought, I think it's so funny. Out of the gate, everybody's come out hard, either whether it's Chrome or IDFA, and pull things back a bit. You hear some people even talk about they don't really think the third-party cookie will ultimately die the death that everyone expects it to. Anyway, what would your prediction be?
I will try to avoid that tricky question, but saying that in the end, it doesn't really matter, because even with third-party cookies in Chrome, this is only a 65% reach solution. And it's not even a great solution anyway.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great wake-up call that we have to do better for publishers and brands to enable them to transact with each other outside of the walled gardens with a more efficient infrastructure, and that needs a redefinition of identity. The Chrome cookie has been kind of a lifeline that we've hung on to, but I think it's, the threat of it going away has made a lot of people realize the importance that this has. And so maybe it won't go away. I don't have a crystal ball into what Google wants to do. Frankly, I don't think it's a privacy question. I think it's a competitiveness question. I think what they're going through in terms of like antitrust in the US will have a huge impact on their decision to protect the ad business, or on the contrary, impact the ad business to be seen less monopolistic. There's so many dimensions that we don't even realize. I think it will be a consequence of many things, but the willingness for Chrome to protect users' privacy, or the Google's attitude towards the publishers and the advertising market. I think there's a lot of other things. So it's an impossible prediction to make. I don't know. I think
that's okay. We got a good answer. You don't have to give us an exact date.
We're certainly trying to be ready for any case, really, right?
Yes,
if third-party cookies are still there is still a lot of things we can do with you guys around improving the efficiency of that space. And if it's not there, we have Universal ID, which is hopefully a scalable replacement, and there will be a solution in Firefox and also in Chrome if cookies disappear there.
Yeah. Great. Well, Mathieu, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure as always. And looking forward to seeing the results and clarifying the identity space in the future with you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for your continued trust and for the relationship we've been together. And I'll return the invitation very soon on an ID5 podcast.
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.